Freedom of speech. I'm happy that I can say nearly anything I want to you right now, but I'm not free to say just anything. There are laws against slander and libel, for instance. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater, like Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said. It's a clear and present danger if you do it. So where do we draw the lines on free speech? When do you have freedom to post what you want online, and when don't you have that freedom? And to what level do we want the government involved? I mean, you can't exactly yell fire in a crowded internet, but if you yell, I'm going to kill so-and-so on the internet, now what? Well, do we want the government using AI to monitor everyone online to save us from future violence? Or what about that old saying about the degree of which we're willing to trade away our freedom for safety? Well, we're going to talk about that all under the headline of our freedom of speech here in the United States of America. And online with us is Mr. Mike Sharman. And Mike is the legal counsel for the nonprofit Christian healthcare sharing ministry, Share Healthcare. But Mike, we're talking about freedom of speech today, and I know you've got your arsenal built up and you're ready to jump into it. So go ahead and dive in on this subject.
Well, thank you, Doug, and thank you for what you're doing every single day to promote free speech and to use free speech. And I think it's interesting, too, and important for us to know that what you do, being on a Christian radio station and making sure the Christian message gets out there, is the whole embodiment of the First Amendment. So I want to start off by reading that so that we really get a context for what we're talking about. So the First Amendment is the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights, and it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. All right, so it begins with the state can't make any, whatever government system, they can't make a religion, and they can't prohibit us from exercising our religion. And then to support that, we, of course, have the right to speak about these things. And we have the right to publish about these things. Now, back then, the only publication was in print form. Well, now we have radio, we have streaming, we have the internet, we have a myriad tools of publication. And that then also allows us to call together the people peaceably to assemble for evangelization or for protest or just for information, and then also to petition our government for a redress of grievances. Now, we couldn't do any of those things unless we had within that First Amendment the freedom of speech. We wouldn't be able to deal with a government that does establish religion unless we could speak to others, publish to get their attention, gather together, and then petition their grievances. So the freedom of speech is incredibly important. If we don't have freedom of speech, we don't have the freedom of the press. If we don't have freedom of speech, we can't get people around to assemble. We can't petition our government. So that freedom of speech is a core freedom that we have in the United States. It's absolutely essential for us to protect it. And we can see what happens in a nation that does not have a Bill of Rights. We think of other nations like Canada and the United Kingdom, England, as having governments similar to ours, but they are not. England does not have a written constitution. We have a written constitution. England only has what is known as the common law, the building up of rules and laws and cases, year after year, so that it forms the common law of the people. And there are certain principles that go through all those different precedents, those different cases, that you can then see and discern as a principle of common law to apply. So one would have thought free speech was a common law principle in England. And a comedy writer, Graham Lineham, who's a an Irish comedy writer, which is, in the United Kingdom. He probably thought he had freedom of speech since he's a comedy writer, etc. Well, he had been here in the U.S. visiting, took a flight back to England, to Heathrow Airport, and when he arrived at Heathrow Airport, he was greeted by 5 armed policemen. Now, armed policemen is almost a non sequitur in England to begin with. Your Bobby, your patrol officer, does not carry a weapon. They just don't. So when you have when the policemen then go to their armory and get a pistol and be an armed policeman, that's extraordinary. And for 5 of them to show up at an airport to arrest a comedy writer, you wonder, what sort of horrible thing did this person do? Well, he wrote 3 comedic posts about transgenders, and he was against them. And specifically, he had, here's what he had written. He said, if a trans-identified male is in a female-only space, he's committing a violent, abusive act. And then if that happens, somebody should make a scene, call police, or even punch the offender. Okay, so there's his incitement to violence. Maybe punch the offender, that male who's in a female private space. Sounds reasonable to me. But that called for 5 armed policemen to come and arrest him. And so he was arrested, taken away, and he mentions the only restriction on his bail, he was bailed out, of course, and the only restriction on his bail is he couldn't speak. He couldn't post anything on X. That was it. He would have to be quiet about that on X while he was in the United Kingdom, and he would have to come back in a few months for another interview to see if he had done that. That was so much for free speech in England. Mm-hmm. Even the head of the police in England said, this is not what we're supposed to be doing. But police don't make the laws. So then here in the U.S., all right, so there he's arrested for having written in a post, hypothetically, because this wasn't a real person he was talking about. It was generally, if a transgender is in your space, a transgender male is in a private female space, call the cops, do something, make a scene, or maybe even punch the person. All right, so that's his incitement for violence. Well, here in the United States, in our capital, in Washington, D.C., just this past week, the grand jury met to, among other things, to consider the indictments of 2 people who had actually made threats to assassinate President Trump and admitted it in their interview with law enforcement. It wasn't hypothetical. It wasn't a generic statement. It was a literal statement. I'm going to kill President Trump. And one was a guy and one was a woman. So the woman was Natalie Rose Jones, and these were 2 separate events. So Natalie Rose Jones came across 5 different states to do specifically that. That's what she had said she was going to do. That's what she said she wanted to do. When she was interviewed by Secret Service agents after her arrest, that's what she said she was planning to do. And the grand jury in D.C. would not indict her. And likewise, the same was true for Edward Alexander Dana, who had said that he had threatened to kill the president. All right, so in the UK, you can suffer an arrest for making a generic statement about what should be done if a transgender male is in your women's private space. 5 armed policemen show up. Here in the U.S., in our nation's capital, when 2 people make specific threats to kill our president, who's had 2 assassination attempts on him, a grand jury won't even indict him. And for those of the listeners who don't know, so these people were arrested. Natalie Rose Jones was arrested. Alexander Dana was arrested. One's made threats against the president. So what's the standard by which a law enforcement officer can arrest somebody? They have to, more probably than not, believe that a crime has been committed, and more probably than not, believe that the person who they are going to arrest is the person who committed that crime. So it's more probable than not. If the tip the scales just tips ever so much in the direction of more probably, then they should be arrested. So the officers thought that. Now, we're a nation of checks and balances. We don't want the officers to arrest a person, toss them in jail, and they just molder there forever. So our system is that if it's a felony, they need to be taken up before a grand jury, which is only the prosecution evidence is presented to the grand jury, because they're essentially sitting as citizen law enforcement people, making the same decision as the arresting officer did. Was the crime more probably than not committed, and was it more probably than not committed by the person who were asked to indict? And so they had the same evidence that the law enforcement officers had, that, Natalie Rose Jones traveled across 5 states having said that she wanted to kill the president, traveled here to Washington, D.C., and where interviewed by the Secret Service, she said, yep, that's right. I'm going to kill the president. I want to kill the president. And they refused to indict. So even though that speech is what we would want to restrict, we have a complete breakdown of our system where, because D.C. is beyond overwhelmingly Democrat, the stats are basically that we have 4 to 6% Republican in Washington, D.C., which means that's how many people you have on your jury panel. You're only going to have, a very few people who would be in favor of President Trump on your jury panel, in your grand jury. So they're going to be biased against him, and they exercise that bias. They did not have blind justice working. And that's not what we want. We want speech to be circumscribed when it is dangerous, and here it wasn't. But then we have almost the opposite problem from that. We're looking at speech from a number of different angles. The comedian in Europe and in England should be able to make political or philosophical or cultural comments without getting arrested by 5 armed policemen. People who threaten to kill our president and specifically say that's what they're planning to do, because threatening to kill the president is a federal crime of itself. They should be indicted. They should stay in trial. But then, after the shooting at the Annunciation Catholic School in Minneapolis a short while ago, a person, Aaron Cohen, who is a former Israel Defense Forces operative, he mentioned that he has a program that, as he calls it, is a 24/7 detective scrubbing the internet, looking for these indications of mass violence, because that Annunciation Catholic School shooter had posted all sorts of social media statements that he was planning on killing innocent children. So Aaron Cohen's proposal is that, scrubbing the internet, looking for people who are saying these things, he can then alert the law enforcement who just happened to pay to subscribe to his program, which I think is called Trace. And then they would be able to be alerted to people who are speaking on the internet about violence, and then go interview them and arrest them. Okay. And not many of us would disagree with that being helpful. But just like the police in the United Kingdom, it's all in the eye of the beholder. Would we want the United Kingdom to be subscribing to his program to look for people who are speaking against homosexuality or against transgender or against abortionists? No, just speaking against them, because that's all that United Kingdom comedian did. So how do we balance these things? One, it really requires us to be exercising our right in the First Amendment. Because remember, Congress isn't supposed to establish religion. We are supposed to be proclaiming the gospel. Congress isn't supposed to prohibit our exercise of free religion. We're supposed to be the ones exercising our Christian beliefs, because then we will inform the culture. We're going to be having police who have a biblical worldview, and they're going to be exercising and enforcing secular civil laws, but they aren't going to be ridiculous like those police in England. And they aren't going to be ignoring what the grand jury ignored here in D.C. it's going to have that proper balance. Because remember, Doug, I've mentioned a number of times, we're supposed to be a nation following the rule of law under God.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't have God involved in it, we're having a big problem. So when our First Amendment and the rules that we had in the Bill of Rights were being proposed, Madison, here's a quote of Madison, he said, "If we confine ourselves to an enumeration of simple, acknowledged principles, the ratification will meet with but little difficulty." So remember, he had written out the Bill of Rights his original draft of it went through a couple committees to refine and make it a little bit more eloquent what he had put down. But he wanted to have, as he said, if we confine ourselves to these, what they've decided upon, the first 10 amendments, an enumeration of simple, acknowledged principles, will have the ratification with little difficulty. You had to have ratification by the states. Otherwise, you couldn't change the Constitution. You couldn't amend the Constitution to accept these things. So what was acknowledged? Well, that we ought to have free religion. We ought to have free speech. But it was also acknowledged that it would be a rule of law under God. And there was lots of debates going back and forth on what they should do. But the main law book at the time was Blackstone's Laws and Commentaries. And Blackstone had said on the issue of free speech, every freeman has an undoubted right to lay what sentiments he pleases before the public. To forbid this is to destroy the freedom of the press. But, here's a big deal now, here's the balance. But if he publishes what is improper, mischievous, or illegal, he must take the consequences of his own temerity. To punish as the law does at present any dangerous or offensive writings, which when published shall on a fair and impartial trial be adjudged of a pernicious tendency, is necessary for the preservation of peace and good order, of government and religion, the only solid foundations of civil liberty. He says, thus the will of the individuals is still left free. The abuse only of that free will is the object of legal punishment. Neither is any restraint hereby laid upon freedom of thought or inquiry. Liberty of private sentiment is still left. The disseminating or making public of bad sentiments, destructive to the ends of society, is the crime which society corrects. So the guy in England was punished for the exact opposite. He was trying to promote good society, but because there were bad morals in that society, bad faith, bad religion, he's arrested. Here in the U.S., the officers arrested the people because they were wanting to do what was harmful to society, assassinate a president. And yet, because we had bad morals, bad religion, bad civil view in our grand juries in D.C., they were set free. We need to have a balance, and that balance should not be that we have the 24/7 detective that's subject to, that can be used as a club against Christians, against people who are just wanting to promote true freedom, if the people using it have the opposite viewpoint. That's the big problem. Any of these levers of government, any of these tools of power can be misused if the person in their own heart is not under the rule of law that God has set out.
The idea, as I understand it, behind free speech is that if you have free speech, then the truth will win out. Yes,
that's right. But we've never said that you can say something false that's demonstrably false. You know, you mentioned libel and slander. Okay, well, libel and slander is you are promoting a factually false idea. You aren't expressing an opinion that's disfavored. That's perfectly fine. I mean, perfectly legal. That is free speech. And that's what you're talking about, of the truth will win out. If we have libel and slander laws actually working, where false facts being published aren't allowed, then the truth will win out. But if true facts are what is being censored, and only false facts are being allowed, then the people won't know the truth, so the truth isn't going to have a chance to win out. Did that make sense?
Yeah, my understanding of slander and libel is that it's just if you're talking about a person and spreading lies. If you want to spread lies about vaccines, for example, then that doesn't fall under slander or libel. You could tell lies about vaccines all the live long day, as far as I know.
Well, kind of yes, kind of no. It depends on what context and to whom. But what you're really talking about is who has standing to sue in slander or libel.
Mm-hmm.
You only have standing if you are going to be personally injured by that.
Mm-hmm.
So, a person who has been injured by a vaccine and relied upon published statements about it that were false, they have standing to sue for that false statement. Now, it's not typically going to be a slander suit, because slander would be if one vaccine company had a side-by-side column ad, said, this is what our vaccine does, here's the harm the other guy's vaccine does. And if it's true, perfectly fine. If it's false of what they said on either side, that other company can sue them. So false facts can be sued upon, even for something like vaccine. A lot of times we get confused on slander and gossip. Gossip is something that is true, but it's none of your business to be talking about it. Mm-hmm. That's what the Bible talks about. Slander, which the Bible also talks about, are false facts that are republished. And, that violates one of the Ten Commandments. It's lying. You're not allowed to give false witness against someone. So when we say free speech does not mean you can steal somebody else's right by what you say. And that's what you do when you're presenting a false fact. You can't steal somebody else's peace or bodily integrity by what you say. If the person's jogging and they're in a crowd and somebody else in the crowd says, that person just sexually assaulted me, go get them, and the crowd runs and tackles the person, and it is not true, they were just a jogger, then that statement the person made is actionable, and we would want it to be actionable. So free speech can only be free if we're not stealing from other people their actual rights by what we say. Now, we can debate and have opinion, and that's perfectly permissible. Now, what happened in the United Kingdom is the guy was arrested for his opinion. That's literally it. And many of our hate speech statutes do the same thing now here in the United States. If you just proclaim something against another group, then it's hate speech, and you're not allowed to do it. We could go on in volume about what subsections we can talk about in free speech. But the basic premise that we want to keep in mind is we have a right in the First Amendment to each one of those things I mentioned, a right of our religion, a right to speak, a right to assemble, a right to talk to, gather together to present grievances against the state. And when speech is falsely constrained so that opinions are stopped, but actual threats are not, it's time for us as a culture and a nation to begin getting back together and looking at what's really important. And have we been properly exercising each of these? These things would not happen if we as the body of Christ had properly been establishing our faith, establishing Christianity. It would not happen if we had been exercising it in the way that Christ had asked us to. If we've been exercising Galatians, I think it's 5:22 to 23, which is the fruits of the Spirit, and not working out our flesh things of greed and anger and all that, which is Galatians 5:19 to 21, I think. If we'd really been being Christians, acting that out, we wouldn't be having these things. If we'd been speaking up when we need to, there's study after study shows that Christians are more likely to vote than the surrounding community. But we don't. We don't. And we need to. We need to get together and have as many rallies as the protesters do. We've been seeing these fairly ridiculous rallies about supporting terrorists, supporting gang members, supporting guys that murder health insurance executives. There's been, big rallies about that. Well, how come we aren't rallying when a congressman or senator does something that we want them to? The Brooklyn Tabernacle is the only church I've ever heard of where people actually had to get tickets to attend because it was a really popular church, and because real estate's expensive in New York, they just couldn't expand easily. But that's what we ought to be doing. We ought to be assembling a lot at our churches. And we need to, whenever there is a problem with our government, we need to petition them in person, by email, on foot, in writing, in all sorts of ways to get them to change. And if we don't, we wind up with a government that we don't want, but that because of our omissions, we deserve.
Some great reminders to stay involved. We're talking with Mike Sharman. I said at the beginning, you're the legal counsel for Share Healthcare. So where does Share Healthcare fit into this conversation of free speech?
Well, we wouldn't be able to do this, and by your mentioning it and promoting it, we wouldn't be able to do this if we didn't have free speech. We wouldn't grow if we don't have our members being able to talk to their friends and their family and say, hey, here's this healthcare sharing ministry that I'm with, and you might want to be a part of it. The friend asks, well, why? Well, because it's Christians gathering together with Christians. It's a nonprofit. We share each other's medically necessary medical expenses. Oh, yeah, your friend said, well, how much is it? Well, we're $149 for a single, and then $249 for a couple, and $349 for a family of four, and $50 for everybody after that. So we wouldn't have that freedom of speech, and we wouldn't be able to publish and send out pamphlets on it if we didn't have that. And that's an exercise of our religion. It's not insurance, and so it's not cheap insurance or something along those lines. It's an exercise of our religion. God has told us quite a few different ways of how we are to act toward one another in the body of Christ, but Share Healthcare's life verse, so to speak, is Hebrews 13:16. But do not forget to do good and to share, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased. That's the exercise of our religion. And when we don't exercise our religious muscles, they atrophy. And we're seeing that result in our culture. So it's time for us to assemble as we can. And now, in our era, we don't just physically assemble. We assemble by association. We assemble on the internet. We assemble by correspondence. And that's what Share Healthcare is that people across denominations, people across the nation, and literally around the world share with one another and share in one another's medical burdens, share in one another's prayer burdens. And then when Share Healthcare has not been attacked by government, fortunately, thank you very much, Lord, but other healthcare sharing ministries have, and we do need to stand together and petition the government for redress of that when it occurs. We're using the opportunities that have been given to us in the past because of that. Healthcare sharing did not exist at the end of in the 1980s, 1990s. And there was legislation that was able to be written and passed protecting it. And then when the Affordable Care Act came in, that protection was put into the Affordable Care Act so that members who are in a healthcare sharing ministry are exempt from the Affordable Care Act and don't have to follow those things, so that we can, again, exercise a religion by being part of a medical sharing group that doesn't share in abortions, doesn't share in abortifacients, doesn't share in the transgender destruction or things like that. None of those things could we do if we weren't protected by the First Amendment.
Well, if people want to find out more about Share Healthcare, and maybe it'll be helpful to them and their family, what do they need to do?
Well, exercise the First Amendment. Go up on to the internet and look up sharehealthcare.com, sharehealthcare.com. Write down your questions as you're scrolling through it and looking around, and then call 1-844-SHARE-HC, 844-SHARE-HC, and call during business hours, and there'll be a live person on the other end of the phone answering your question.
Well, I'm so thankful that we have the freedoms that we have, including to have Christian organizations like Share Healthcare and Christian radio and such, and that we can make these interviews and podcasts and not be worried about the government come knocking at the door. But if we don't stay on the ball, we can lose these freedoms. So thank you, Mike Sharman, for talking about these important issues. And for Wave 94, I'm Doug Apple.